Welcome to Critical Thinking. I'm your host, Waymon Hudson, and each episode will be bringing you in-depth discussions with newsmakers and opinion shapers on all things political in the LGBT community. On today's episode, we're taking on what for too long has been seen as a divide in the fight for civil rights and equality, the intersection of race and LGBT issues. We often see issues of race and LGBT equality discussed as, at the very least, disconnected, and at the worst, at total odds with each other. This very premise overlooks a very obvious but important fact. LGBT people of color exist. This perceived disconnect causes real harm to people of color in the LGBT community, who are often hit harder by discrimination and more marginalized in their needs due to combined exposure of anti-gay or anti-transgender policies, along with institutionalized racial discrimination. This perceived divide between where race and LGBT issues intersect also allows for opponents of equality to try and divide minority communities for political gain. We saw this with the National Organization for Marriage's offensive strategy for victory, where they laid out a stark plan to drive a wedge between people of color and the LGBT community in the effort to fight issues like marriage equality by reinforcing perceived tensions between these communities. And those perceived tensions are nothing new. We saw this notion rear its ugly head after Prop 8 passed in California, where faulty early exit polling seemed to show that black voters who turned out for Obama also caused the law to pass. Later studies actually showed that 4 factors, party affiliation, ideology, frequency of religious service attendance, and age drove the yes vote for Proposition 8. Thankfully, in recent years, we have seen this idea of a combative relationship between minority communities shift dramatically. This coming together across minority communities has been building momentum, from Obama's vocal support of marriage equality and LGBT issues to groups like the NAACP and the National Council of La Raza coming out in support for equal rights for the LGBT community. In fact, studies from the most recent election show a rapid shift to majority support for LGBT issues from all communities of color. To help us break down these complex issues around race and LGBT equality, I sat down with Constitutional Law Professor Olympia Duhart of Nova Southeastern University, where she's the director of the Lawyering Skills and Values program. She's also a contributor to the NAACP Defenders Online, SALT Law, and the Huffington Post. Professor Duhart, thank you so much for joining us here on Critical Thinking.
Thank you for having me.
No problem. I'm really excited to have you here to talk about race and its intersection with the LGBT community and sexual orientation and gender identity. I think it's a really vital conversation. And I actually think that before we jump into all the topics, because there's a lot to talk about, I think it's important that we kind of quantify and qualify exactly what we mean when we say these terms, when we talk about people of color, when we talk about the LGBT community. I think we can't just assume, and I think part of the problem is that we do assume too often that they're these monolithic groups.
Right, that's a common misperception, that there's one voice, there's one black voice, there's one Hispanic voice, there's one Asian voice, there's one gay voice, there's one Christian voice, so I'm glad you mentioned that.
Yeah, I think it's really important to say that, not everyone can fit neatly into a box, and I actually think it disenfranchises a huge group of people, LGBT people of color. They're not two separate groups.
Yeah, and the entire discourse is flawed because we start from this premise traditionally that people fit into one category, right? So no one is just one box. So when you get to people who are dealing with multiple identities and dealing with multiple facets of their identities, it's really critical to recognize how that works together, and it does tend to create simultaneous oppression.
And I think by not recognizing that all of those things can be in the same person and talking like everything is so completely separate, like it's, people of color versus LGBT people, as opposed to, someone that could be all of those things. There is no hard dividing line between these things. It's a very fluid, identity itself is very fluid.
And it's impossible to disaggregate it. I can't focus on my blackness and exclude my womanhood, right? So you have to deal with all of those different facets of your lives as a person. So when we're having the conversation, we have to unpack them individually and look at the different layers that people are dealing with. That's what makes it so sad that we've allowed, in some ways, common oppressors to polarize communities that should be working together.
Right after Prop 8, it was a huge story, and erroneously reported that it was the high African-American turnout that came out to vote for President Obama that made Proposition 8 in California pass. And it became this horrible media meme of it was black people's fault. And, you know, that was all based on exit polling and just kind of...
And it was based on the fact that blacks showed up in record numbers to vote for President Obama. But the information wasn't accurate, so the press's hands aren't clean. And then when you start to really look at the facts and the numbers, it wasn't race, there were other factors. Age, I think church attendance.
Absolutely, religiosity played a huge part of it, education level, all of those things. And I think that goes back to our point of not everyone can be so neatly put in boxes.
And it seemed like almost collateral damage to Prop 8, that in addition to that, you get the extra damage of now there's a wedge that somehow emerged between the black community and the gay community, which ignores the fact that there are black gays, right? So that seemed like it was an accident, but what's even scarier is what we're starting to see now with NOM.
Absolutely. The National Organization for Marriage, which we've talked about on the show a lot, actually, they literally said in words they wanted to drive a wedge between black voters and LGBT people.
Yeah, I'm smiling because it's still incredible to me that this actually happened. I'm just in shock. And the example that I keep thinking about is imagining people with the National Organization for Marriage sitting in a conference room, developing a strategy, articulating it on paper, memorializing it as a way to divide the black community and the gay community, the wedge strategy. It's like thinking about cigarette manufacturers sitting in a conference room and thinking about how to market their cigarettes to children. In my wildest dreams, I didn't think that that would actually be intentional and deliberate, but we know now that it is. So that's actually the best evidence that there's a really big opportunity for us to build community and work together. The fact that we have common oppressors who have recognized if we don't create a wedge between this community and that community, whether it's black community and the gay community, or the Hispanic community and the gay community, or the Asian community and the gay community, together, we must be very powerful, or have the potential to be very powerful if we work together, if we have a bunch of folks sitting down trying to figure out how to create tension and polarize us.
Absolutely, and I think now that we've seen it on paper, it's not just a casual collateral damage effect, but it's an actual political decision-making process.
It's an affirmative strategy, and it's a funded affirmative strategy.
Absolutely.
Which makes it even more difficult for us to, with limited resources, to overcome. But this conversation is really key in conversations like this. A lot of times I think people are reluctant to acknowledge some of the tension between different fragments of the community, but that opens the door for people to come in and create a lot of dissension and start a lot of rumors and then get some traction with it, which unfortunately the National Organization for Marriage has been able to do by deploying certain black ministers to deliver their message for them. But we have to remember that what happens in the pulpit and what happens among the parishioners is different. So not all of these ministers are working for the National Organization for Marriage. We need to recognize that we are dealing with lots of different voices out here, and sometimes the most ignorant, the most ill-informed, the least representative of the group speaks the loudest. Mm-hmm. So it's important to make sure that other people speak up.
For Barack Obama, our current president, to come out in support of marriage equality, not just for the whole country, but specifically to create room for a dialogue among people of color, among the LGBT community. It created room to say, no, there's different points of view from here, and put a face on that as well.
Exactly, and I was very proud of President Obama, and I am a card-carrying member of the NAACP, and I was very proud of the NAACP for recognizing that marriage equality is a civil rights issue. And as an organization that's committed to civil rights for all people, it is the duty of the NAACP and other people who are committed to that to work for marriage equality for everyone. Ben Jealous, as you know, made a really beautiful statement about it. And Julian Bond, who is a former NAACP president and a civil rights icon, has also been very vocal in his support for marriage equality. One of the things that I'm excited about with the coalition building that I see emerging with Ben Jealous, with Julian Bond, with President Obama, is the opportunity to allow what's happened with the Black civil rights struggle to inform what can happen with the gay civil rights struggle. So rather than look at two different communities that are polarized, there's a big chance here to work together and build some strategy to break down some of the structural discrimination that has really oppressed both communities.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining us here on Critical
Thank
Thinking,
you
Olympia.
for having me.
These discussions, while sometimes difficult and uncomfortable to have, are vitally important to our success as a movement. Breaking down preconceived notions, challenging assumptions, and combating blatant moves to divide and conquer minority communities can only be done if we take a look at where our issues intersect. For example, a recent report by the Center for American Progress's FIRE initiative found that the combined exposure to anti-LGBT policies, along with institutionalized racial discrimination, derails Black, gay, and transgender Americans' financial stability, creates barriers to accessing quality health care, and erodes safeguards for gay and transgender families. This is also true for other LGBT communities of color. Consequently, they face high rates of unemployment or underemployment. The youth in these communities also experience lower educational attainment and higher rates of homelessness than their peers. We must also recognize the similarities and differences in civil rights struggles and welcome our allies, like the NAACP and La Raza, with open arms. Well-funded anti-equality organizations, like the National Organization for Marriage, are attempting to split our communities, and we cannot let them succeed. We have seen this election cycle what can happen when we come together. Maine, Maryland, Washington State all passed new marriage equality laws on Election Day, while voters in Minnesota defeated a marriage ban. African Americans and Latinos were a big reason why. According to national polls, 52% of both Black and Latino voters who turned out this year said they support gay marriage in their states. And those are numbers we can continue to build by having these conversations. But having allies also means being allies. Just like we want support, the LGBT community needs to be involved in expanding racial, social, gender, and economic justice. Our goal should be, quite simply put, equality for all. And that's Waymon's Wrap Up. You can join our discussion and ask me questions on Twitter using the hashtag Waymon Wrap Up and on our Critical Thinking Facebook page, where you can see exclusive behind-the-scenes photos and information. And be sure to join us here on gaytvonthego.com for new episodes. Once again, I'm your host, Waymon Hudson, reminding you that when it comes to LGBT politics, you can always use a little more critical thinking.